8, the honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And it is, I stand again proud to represent and stand with and for the people of Battle River Crowfoot. But it's unfortunate that after 9 years of those Liberals leading this country, that we are once again debating a scandal of unbelievable proportions. And I want to talk a little bit about the circumstances that led us to the SDTC situation, and then I want to dive into why documents matter, what this violation of the privilege of members of this place is, and why that should be so concerning to Canadians. So, Mr. Speaker, the Sustainable Development Technologies Canada, the Auditor General did a report that found that the Liberals, that Prime Minister, those ministers had turned it into a slush fund for Liberal insiders. And a recording of a senior civil servant slammed the, quote, outright incompetence of that government that gave more than $390 million worth of contracts inappropriately. Mr. Speaker, to put that into context, $390 million is an astounding number when it comes to the amount of money, especially at a time, I would add, Mr. Speaker, when Canadians are hurting. We're seeing, this year we will see more than 2 million Canadians forced to visit a food bank. And I know in my own constituency, I speak to, of which many are not-for-profits hosted out of churches or community centres, local food banks, that because of the actions of this government, things like the carbon tax, the mismanagement of the economy that's led to increased inflation, among so many other things. Canadians at record numbers are forced to visit food banks. And in some cases, as I see some of the numbers that have been provided to me by local food banks, often ran by volunteers, it is absolutely heartbreaking. And Mr. Speaker, I would just note that in one case, it was interesting because I heard from some of the folks that run one of these local food banks that it was stunning to them how it was not just folks that had fallen on hard times that were forced to visit the food bank, not just those who had lost their jobs forced to visit the food bank, but in some cases, people that you knew around the community that were simply had no other options. Their credit cards had been maxed out. They didn't have anything left in order to feed their children at home. So they were, in those cases, Mr. Speaker, forced to visit a food bank. That is the legacy of these Liberals. Yet while Canadians are hurting, 25% of Canadians, according to reports, are facing poverty-like conditions. And Mr. Speaker, what is this government's response? $390 million worth of contracts inappropriately given out, many of which went to well-connected Liberal insiders. $390 million not going to help Canadians, not going to grow the economy. $390 million, more money than most people could ever imagine, going to well-connected insiders. The Auditor General found that SDTC gave $58 million to 10 ineligible projects. They couldn't get this, Mr. Speaker. That government that talks big about the environment, yet they gave $58 million to projects supposedly to help the environment. That was the reason this fund was created. But they could not demonstrate that there would be an environmental benefit or the development of any green tech. So, Mr. Speaker, I would urge any Canadian who is watching, and I know there are many because of the absolute corruption that has been normalized under this Liberal government and that Prime Minister supported by those NDP, it is absolutely astounding that in the midst of a time where they talk big about the environment, they are giving dollars to projects connected with Liberal insiders that didn't even try to explain, didn't even try to defend what they were doing as being good for the environment, even though that was the creation of these programs. The Auditor General made it clear that the blame for this scandal falls on that government and the industry minister who did not sufficiently, quote, did not sufficiently monitor, unquote, the contracts that were given to Liberal insiders. And now, Mr. Speaker, I hear often from members of that side of the House, and I do hear it from Canadians as well, say, well, what would you do differently? Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to stand as a part of a party that takes governing seriously, that would fight corruption and incompetence, especially the sort of incompetence that leads to this type of gross mismanagement scandal, and to the tune of $390 million being misappropriated. So, Mr. Speaker, I told you that I wanted to talk about why the finding of a violation of privilege is such an important issue. And I believe that it's the sort of thing that many outside of this place, in fact, I would suggest, certainly from some of the questions that I've heard from members of other parties in this place, that they don't take seriously Parliament's constitutional role. So let me unpack that a little bit for you, Mr. Speaker, and for the benefit of those watching, and why I started suggesting that documents matter. Because it is less about whether or not there's physical documents that you can read from that's not the whole point here. The point is that we have an institution that is Parliament, that is in our Westminster system of governance, is the supreme authority of our country. And we have, as parliamentarians, that which makes up a parliament. A parliament is defined by the fact that in the case of the current circumstance, although I believe there are 2 Liberal vacancies with by-elections forthcoming and the rate at which the Liberals are losing seats, it will certainly be interesting to watch what those election results are. But a parliament is made up by MPs. And the MPs that make up that parliament have unfettered access to call for documents and for people to come. Now, we talk about that a lot in the context of committee, and it is a key element of the constitutional role that this place plays in our country. And we cannot dismiss the importance, because that is what is the cornerstone of the democratic system that we have. The fact that it is this place, the only place in the country, I would add, Mr. Speaker, that is truly representative of our country. Every square inch of the nation of Canada is represented in this place, and only in this place. So that's why Parliament is given such significant latitude to be able to do things like call for documents. So what did the government refuse to do? Well, they refused to be transparent and provide these documents. They gave a whole litany of excuses. In fact, I found it very interesting when the House Leader was speaking very negatively about the Speaker's ruling that has led to this debate. She was quite astonishingly, she pivoted away from saying that she was disputing the ruling, but said that she was dismayed at the ruling. Well, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that any member of this place who is dismayed at the constitutional authority of what Parliament is meant to be needs to go back and look at the history, the construction in terms of the constitutional reality, and the traditions that make up what this place is. Because it has to come down to the very idea that where does the buck stop? Well, it stops with Parliament. And now I want to highlight something in the context of what I've just described, Mr. Speaker, because we have seen under these Liberals a concerning trend of wanting to distance the executive function of government from Parliament. Now, I understand that it is inconvenient that the Liberals do not have unfettered power to do anything they want. That is an inconvenient thing that they are forced up against. Now, I have seen over the last close to 5 years that I've had the honor of serving in this place and serving the people of Battle River Crowfoot, how they've been able to sign deals with and backroom handshakes and the whole deal with other opposition parties in order to have a functional majority. But, Mr. Speaker, the Canadians sent a minority parliament to Ottawa in the last election. And this place has the ability to do things like demand documents and has the full constitutional right to do so. And it is outlined very, very clearly that that is, in fact, the case. And Mr. Speaker, when you have members of the government that are making excuses and figuring out ways around this place, it is deeply concerning and should cause every Canadian, regardless of what political party they're a part of, quite frankly. This is not a partisan issue. This is a Canadian issue. And the member from Winnipeg over there seems to be laughing when I say that the very foundation of our institutions is not a partisan issue. And I think therein lies, Mr. Speaker, the problem. You have the very foundation of our democratic system taken so flippantly by members like that who would pursue their own personal, political, and as we see outlined through the course of this SDTC scandal that includes back in 2018 when former Minister Navdeep Bains didn't like the fact that the board chair of SDTC was criticizing things the government was doing, so replaced at contrary advice to those within his own department, and we've seen a continuation of that sort of political manipulation since that have led to this scandal. A very, very clear timeline that has been laid out, Mr. Speaker. They do not take seriously Parliament's role. Now, I understand that they would rather an audience than an opposition. They would rather be able to simply have carte blanche to do whatever they want to pursue their own personal, political, financial, and other interests. But, Mr. Speaker, that's not how this place works. MPs are sent here to represent their constituents. And I would speak now, if I could, Mr. Speaker, to the Liberal backbench especially, because they have an obligation to not simply prop up their Prime Minister, but they are sent here as members of Parliament. We are on the ballot as members of Parliament, and they will stand to be judged in the next election by Canadians as a member of Parliament, and they will have to answer, just like the NDP and the Bloc, for supporting this type of corruption. They will have to stand to answer for that. So I would encourage them to take seriously the role that this place is meant to play, because as we have seen a distancing that the way that the Liberals operate is they want to have unfettered control to do whatever they want, and they treat Parliament only as an inconvenience. And that, Mr. Speaker, is truly a national scandal that is eroding the trust that Canadians should be able to have in their institutions. So, Mr. Speaker, it has been said that especially in a democracy and as a proud Canadian, as somebody that has grown up in this country, as somebody who has spent a lot of time looking at being involved as a volunteer, as a staff member, as a passionate politico, I have watched how and studied a lot about government and the institutions, the Parliament in the United Kingdom, the history of our democratic system, how our like systems around the world developed over the course of the last number of centuries, and some of the history that goes much further back than that. And Mr. Speaker, what is so very troubling is that it used to be that you may not like or agree with the person in charge of the country. You may not like the current Liberal Prime Minister. You may not have liked a previous Conservative Prime Minister. You may not have liked a previous Liberal Prime Minister. But you could respect the office and the institutions. Increasingly, Mr. Speaker, I hear from Canadians that are losing trust in the very institutions that we have. And it is actions like this and how those Liberals are so bent on trying to keep the truth from coming out in the case of refusing to provide these documents. Well, now it's the authority of the House and the violation of privilege that has led to the motion that we're debating today and the amendment, which I will be proud to support. It comes down to that very, very simple choice. Now, part of the challenge is that erosion of trust and the normalization of scandal has led so many Canadians to question the legitimacy of much to do with government. And that, Mr. Speaker, is going to take hard work, and I'm so proud to be a part of a party that is committed to doing the hard work required to restore trust in our institutions. to ensure that we can make sure that this place, Parliament, is respected. And Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that at the very root of where we are today, this motion related to SDTC and these documents matter because it is the heart of our parliamentary institutions, our democracy, that is at stake. And we have seen a continual attempts by those Liberals to try and erode that. So, Mr. Speaker, we have a litany. This adds to a litany of scandals that, and it's quite astounding. I talked about the normalization of scandals, and I did. And as soon as the ruling was delivered yesterday evening, I went through and and I reflected on some of the scandals. And as I have been a member of the Ethics Committee for a significant portion of both this and the last Parliament, and we're of course debating the document production related to SDTC. Prior to this, there was a Rive scam and $60+ million on an app that was budgeted to cost less than $100,000. Sole source contracts that we are seeing a massive, both the mismanagement of those contracts today, but how we see that it seems to be going to friends and insiders, and the fact that during a time of crisis, that government would, instead of working in the best interests of Canadians, would choose to enrich their friends. Absolutely shameful. The We Charity scandal, Mr. Speaker, how, again, in the midst of what was a national crisis, the government chose their friends over top of well-established protocols that could have easily been expanded. I think about the Canada Summer Jobs Program. Instead of using a program like that and expanding it, they were going to give $1 billion to their friends. Friends that had given significant benefit and paid to the tunes of hundreds of thousands of dollars to close members of the Prime Minister's family. And I would remind you, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister, because I was on the Ethics Committee at the time, the Prime Minister went as far as to prorogue Parliament to keep the names and the amounts of those payments from coming out. Further, we have the SNC-Lavalin scandal, where the only reason that the RCMP didn't lay charges against a sitting Prime Minister is because they determined it wasn't in the public interest of Canada. Can you imagine, Mr. Speaker? There has been such a deterioration of our institutions that has led to the public interest being deemed that the Prime Minister shouldn't have been dragged in front of a judge on trial. The Aga Khan Island, you have Indigenous contracts, which I know is being studied at committee, how there seem to be Liberal insiders that are manipulating that process, taking money that should be going to First Nations here in this country. We have the massive growth of consultants, Mr. Speaker. In fact, there's been some very interesting editorials of late to say that it's become a consulting capital, that the only way that you get anything done is that if you hire the right consultants, Mr. Speaker. Well, that's not how a government should be ran. You have billions of dollars in handouts, including, I can't help but think of the ventilators that went to a former Liberal MP and ended up in a scrapyard, and to the tune of, again, hundreds of millions of dollars. So, Mr. Speaker, where does this leave us? Well, once again, MPs will be given a choice to support accountability, and I would go further, support the very foundation of what our democratic system is supposed to be, the idea of parliamentary supremacy. And, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we can get the answers, not that Conservatives want, but that Canadians deserve. That's where the rubber hits the road. So I would urge all members, Liberal backbench, members of the NDP, members of the Bloc Québécois, and the few independents we have. Every MP in this place needs to think seriously about the role of Parliament, the principles of parliamentary supremacy, and ensure that we all do our part to combat the corruption and do the hard work required to restore trust in the institutions that Canadians need to be able to trust, need to be able to look at with respect. So I would urge every member in this place to support this motion, to take seriously our democracy and ensure that that hard work can be done. And Mr. Speaker, let me simply conclude with this, because I have my doubts, because after 9 years we've seen exactly what these Liberals' attitudes is. That when it comes to the hard work of restoring trust, I'm proud to be a part of a party that has a plan, that has the energy, and will put in the effort to restore that trust. When the leader of the official opposition, the member from Carleton, is Prime Minister, we can do that hard work to restore the trust that's required in our institutions and work on behalf of Canadians, not on behalf of insiders. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question et commentaire, l'honorable député de Montcalm.
The Honourable Member for Montcalm. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate my colleague's attempt to situate the debate in the area of ethics. I taught ethics and political philosophy and democracy for 30 years. Let's be very clear. The primary task of an MP is to ensure that there is government accountability, no matter what stripe the government is, whether a majority or minority government. We need to ensure that there is government accountability. When it's a majority government, that can be very difficult to do. When it's a minority government, that's very helpful, because then you may find yourself in a situation like this one. The government made a mistake here. When the House of Commons clearly states that documents must be produced, then that should happen. We are going to need an inquiry to get to the bottom of this. If the RCMP doesn't want the documents, then it won't take them, but we should be able to have them. My question for my colleague: if there were to be an election tomorrow, the Conservative Party would become a majority government. In ethics, we say that a principle is a true principle when it's put into action, when there's an opportunity to do so. So, if he were on the government side of the House, would my colleague be such an ardent defender of this principle, or would he end up changing his tune?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I would just find, and I thank my colleague for the question and what is his background and the context which he would provide. And I would just suggest that all members of this place, and especially Liberals, that they should maybe take lessons, that even though that member is a member of a separatist party, he certainly has a better grasp on the role of what a member of Parliament should do than certainly the backbench of that Liberal Party. And it comes to the very foundation of what we are as parliamentarians. This is, and I tell students that I speak with, and I speak with students on a regular basis, said one of the coolest things about Canadian democracy, Mr. Speaker, and I ask the question is, how many votes does, and I can't say their names, but I would name the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, and other MPs, and I would name myself as well, how many votes do we get to cast on Election Day? And it seems like a trick question, but the answer is one. We all get to cast one vote as Canadians. And likewise, when somebody is elected, we get to occupy the honor of one seat in this place. And I ask the question, how many seats does the Prime Minister occupy, does the Leader of the Opposition occupy? And again, it's one seat. And it is the duty of every member of Parliament, regardless of their political background, regardless of what their history is, to take seriously that obligation that we are as MPs to stand up for the people that sent them here, to be the Parliament, in this case the 44th Parliament, Mr. Speaker, to stand up regardless of what one's political interests are, because as MPs, that's the point.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canada is made up of a foundation of pillars. Democracy is supreme. The parliamentary proceedings that take place here are no doubt very much supreme. But so is justice, in the sense that when you have an independent judicial system, when you have independent institutions like the RCMP, those two are pillars that make Canada the country that it is today. The Conservative motion that says we are going to start collecting information to hand directly over to the RCMP, many would argue is a violation of our Constitution, our Charter, which is a part of our Canadian identity. Does the member not recognize that there's a fine line that has been crossed by the Conservative Party of Canada? We could talk about Conservative scandals, whatever kind of scandals you want. At the end of the day, the Conservative Party has crossed the line.
The honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
See, the irony in the statement that member just made is he talked about Parliament being supreme, but then he went on to say how Parliament can't do anything about this, how Parliament shouldn't look for answers, how Parliament shouldn't do anything to uncover the scandal, the corruption, and the mismanagement of those Liberals. Mr. Speaker, I find it troubling that they will, it seems, stop at nothing to cover up the corruption that is being led by that Prime Minister, the Industry Minister, and members of this government. We are not instructing the RCMP what to do, but for them to suggest that somehow us calling for documents is not part of our jobs as Member of Parliament to get to the bottom of a scandal that has cost taxpayers to the tune of $380-some million. Mr. Speaker, I would encourage that member to go ask his constituents about whether or not he suggests that Parliament has a role to play in finding answers to where this money went.
Questions and comments? Question Kamal-Taira, the honourable member of Selkirk and Lake Eastman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you know, it's just listening to the member from Winnipeg North get up here every time and trying to cover up Liberal corruption and this scandal is just sickening. Now, I want to thank the member from Battle River Crowfoot for his articulation on this to show and actually lay out that this all started with Navdeep Bains when he was the Minister of Industry, appointing Liberal cronies that then were able to line their pockets with taxpayer money while the current Minister of Industry turned a blind eye, willfully turned a blind eye, and also looks like may have actually enriched the value of shares of the Minister from the Environment who has stakes in one of the companies that benefited from all this Liberal largesse and corruption. One of the whistleblowers that they heard at testimony says, I think that the current government is more interested in protecting themselves and protecting the situation being a public nightmare, and they'd rather protect wrongdoers and financial mismanagement than have to deal with a situation like this SDTC and the public sphere. Mr. Speaker, my question to my colleague is, is that actually the definition of Liberal cover-ups and Liberal corruption? Great question.
The honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question posed to my friend from Manitoba, who understands very well and has rightfully pointed out how that member from Winnipeg in his province is covering up the corruption. Because, Mr. Speaker, what we have here is not Conservative accusations, but the fact that the Auditor General, an independent officer of Parliament, has found egregious mismanagement to the tune of $390 million worth of contracts given inappropriately. This was not Conservatives that did the audit. Conservatives have demanded that the audit be done because we saw the inconsistencies and we saw how the chair of the fund was getting these contracts and whatnot, so we called in the auditors. Now, the good thing about the Auditor General, Mr. Speaker, is it takes politics out of it. Now, the Liberals may not like what the auditor found, but the fact is the Auditor General found that to the tune of $390 million, there was money that was mismanaged, went to these Liberal insiders. And in the testimony of whistleblowers, Mr. Speaker, things like saying that made it evidently clear that there was activities that would not pass the smell test, went on to say that the Auditor General surely would find that this mismanagement was true. And, Mr. Speaker, there was one whistleblower that suggested that it was a sponsorship scandal era type of scandals, and that certainly when it comes to mismanagement, that this one Auditor General, I would just like to quote this whistleblower that told the Public Accounts Committee, and I quote, "Just as I was always confident that the Auditor General would confirm the financial mismanagement at SDTC, I remain equally confident that the RCMP will substantiate the criminal activities that occurred within the organization, end quote. Mr. Speaker, those are not my words. Those are the words of a whistleblower from within SDTC. That's what the Liberals are trying to cover up.